The check was already written. Her mother-in-law slid it across the marble table without a word, the way you might slide a receipt across a diner counter. Like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. The number on that check had 6 zeros behind it. $5 million. And all Camille Donovan had to do to collect it was sign a single document, pack whatever she could carry, and leave through the back door before sunrise. No goodbyes. No explanations. No trace. She looked down at that check for a long time. Not because she was tempted. Not because she was calculating. But because she was memorizing. Memorizing the woman across from her. The set of her jaw. The coldness in her eyes. The absolute certainty that she had already won. She memorized the room. The chandelier. The marble floors her knees had touched more times than she cared to count. She memorized the silence from the hallway. The silence from the man she had married, who had been told what was happening tonight and chose not to come downstairs. Camille picked up the pen. She signed the document. She folded that check and placed it in her coat pocket. And then she walked to the back door, just as instructed, just as expected, and she stepped out into the rain without looking back. What Margaret Hargrove Sinclair did not know, what she could not have known, was that the woman she had just paid to disappear was carrying a secret that would one day cost the Hargrove Sinclair family everything they had spent 3 generations building. She did not know that the back door Camille walked out of that night was not an exit. It was a beginning. 8 years later, Camille walked into the Hargrove Sinclair Group's annual shareholders gala through the front entrance. Not as a guest. Not as a plus one. Not as the quiet, accommodating woman who once tried so desperately to belong in rooms that never wanted her. She walked in as the majority owner. As the woman who had spent 8 years building something so undeniable that the very board of directors who had rubber-stamped her removal from the family was now required, by law, to stand when she entered. She did not make a scene. She did not need to. The room did it for her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what Camille had already survived before she ever sat down at that marble table. Camille Donovan grew up in a small city in Ohio, the eldest daughter of a school librarian and a retired postal worker. They were not wealthy people, but they were careful people. Careful with money, careful with words, careful about the kind of character they built in their children. Her mother used to say that your name was the only thing that truly belonged to you, and that once you gave people a reason to say it wrong, you spent a lifetime correcting them. Camille had grown up believing that. She had lived her entire life protecting that. She met Dominic Hargrove Sinclair at a professional development conference in Chicago when she was 29 years old. He was charming in the way that certain men from money are charming. Effortless, unhurried, as though the world had always moved at his preferred pace and always would. He found her interesting. He told her so, more than once. He said she was unlike anyone he had ever met, and at the time, Camille thought he meant it as a compliment. It took her years to understand that what he actually meant was that she was unlike the world he came from, and that for Dominic, novelty had always been a temporary condition. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. In those 2 years, she met his family exactly 4 times. Each meeting had a particular texture to it, polished on the surface, sharp underneath. His mother, Margaret, was the kind of woman who expressed disapproval through impeccable manners. She never raised her voice. She never said anything overtly cruel. She simply asked questions that were designed to remind Camille of what she wasn't. Questions about where she had gone to school. Questions about her family's connections. Questions framed as curiosity but functioning as inventory, an accounting of everything Camille lacked. Dominic never intervened. That was the first thing Camille should have paid more attention to. He would watch his mother dismantle her with a smile, and then change the subject to something comfortable, golf, or a recent business trip, or a dinner reservation he was excited about. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was something arguably worse, a comfortable one. A man so cushioned by his inheritance that conflict had never once been necessary for his survival, and so he had never learned to choose a side. She married him anyway, because she loved him. Or at least, she loved the version of him she believed existed just beneath the comfort and the avoidance. The man who had told her she was unlike anyone he had ever met, and who she believed, somewhere deep and irrational, would one day decide that she was worth defending. The first 3 years of the marriage were not terrible. They were simply quiet in ways that accumulated. Margaret never welcomed her. The family's social circle was cordial but sealed. Camille was included in events the way furniture is included in a room. Present, necessary for appearances, never the point. She smiled through dinners that made her feel invisible. She dressed in ways she thought might please people who had already decided she wouldn't. She worked harder at belonging than she had ever worked at anything in her life, and she watched that work produce exactly nothing. The marriage began to crack in the 4th year, quietly, the way old houses crack, not all at once, but in small places, and then everywhere. Dominic worked longer hours and explained less. He came home to a house that looked perfect and treated it like a hotel. Camille began to understand, slowly and then all at once, that she had not married a partner. She had married a role, and the role was decorative. And she had been failing at it from the beginning, not because she wasn't good enough, but because no version of her was ever going to be what Margaret Hargrove Sinclair wanted standing beside her son. The night of the check was a Tuesday in November. Camille had been waiting for Dominic to come home because she had something to tell him, something that had changed everything for her, that had made her feel, for the first time in years, like the ground beneath her feet might be solid. She had found out 4 days earlier. She had rehearsed how she would say it 100 times. She had imagined his face. She had let herself hope. Margaret arrived first. She came in through the front door with her own key, a detail that should have registered as an alarm and never did, and she sat down across from Camille at that marble table as though she owned the room. Which, technically, she did. The house was in the family trust. That was another detail Camille had let herself stop thinking about. Margaret did not waste time. She placed the document on the table first, then the check, and then she said, very calmly, that it was time for Camille to make a decision about her future. She said that Dominic was not coming home that night. She said that arrangements had already been made. She said that the family had been patient, and that patience had its limits, and that Camille had reached them. She did not call her a stain. She didn't need to. Every word Margaret said was constructed to communicate exactly that. That Camille's presence in this family was a contaminant. That her background, her origins, her very self was something the Hargrove Sinclairs had been tolerating at considerable personal cost. And that the most merciful thing, for everyone, she said, with particular emphasis on everyone, was for Camille to take the money and allow them all to move forward. Camille sat very still through all of it. She did not cry. She did not argue. She thought about the secret she had been holding for 4 days. She thought about what it would mean to tell Margaret right now, to watch her face change. She thought about Dominic upstairs, or wherever he was, having made the decision not to be in this room. And she understood something with a sudden, devastating clarity. If she stayed, if she fought, if she made this a battle, she would be fighting it alone. And she was already carrying something too precious to risk in a war she had no army for. So she signed, and she took the check, and she walked out into the rain with her hand resting over her stomach, protecting the only thing in her life that had not yet betrayed her. The first hours were the hardest. Not because of the grief, though there was grief, for the marriage, for the future she had imagined, for the version of Dominic she had loved who had turned out to be mostly projection. The hardest part was the silence. The particular silence of a woman standing on a wet street corner at 11 o'clock at night with a suitcase and a check for $5 million and absolutely nowhere to go. She walked, not toward anything, just away, because away was the only direction available. The rain had thickened into something serious, and her coat was soaked through within minutes. But she kept walking, because stopping meant standing still with everything she had just lost, and she was not ready for that yet. She had a phone. She had the number of her closest friend, a woman named Rochelle who lived 40 minutes outside the city and who would have come immediately, no questions asked. She did not call her. She just walked and let the rain do what it wanted with her and watched the city move around her with the particular indifference of cities everywhere. The accident happened on Meridian Street, 3 blocks from the hotel she had finally decided to walk toward. She heard the impact before she saw it. The sound of metal and glass arriving suddenly in the quiet, the way violence always does. A dark sedan had gone through a red light and connected with a parked delivery truck on the corner. The sedan had taken the worst of it. Steam was already rising from the hood. Camille was the only person on the block. She stood still for exactly 2 seconds. Then she ran. The man inside the driver's seat was conscious but confused, his face cut from the deployed airbag, one arm pressed at an angle that made her wince. He was trying to open the door, and his hands weren't cooperating. Camille got the door open on the third pull. She talked to him the entire time. Not about anything particular, just steadily, the way her mother had always talked to her during frightening things, so that the sound of a familiar voice could be an anchor. She eased him out of the car and got him to the curb and called 911 and stayed until she could hear sirens and then stayed longer because leaving felt wrong. She didn't know who he was. She didn't ask. He was just a man who was hurt and alone at 11 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday, and that was enough. His name, she would learn the next morning, was Walter Osei. He was 63 years old, a retired federal judge, and the father of the woman who ran one of the most quietly influential private equity firms on the East Coast. He was also, by every account of everyone who knew him, the kind of man whose gratitude was not a small thing. His daughter's name was Adrienne Osei Coleman. She arrived at the hospital at 2 in the morning, and she was exactly what Camille had not expected, not emotional, not frantic, but precise. She moved through a room the way certain people do, as though the space rearranges itself slightly to accommodate them. She spoke to the doctors first, then to her father, and then she turned, and she looked at Camille, still soaked, still wearing her coat, sitting in a plastic chair with her suitcase beside her and nowhere to be. And she asked a single question. She asked if Camille was all right. Not who she was, not what had happened to her, just whether she was all right. And something about the directness of it, the simplicity, broke something loose in Camille that she had been holding very tightly for several hours. She said she was fine. Adrienne looked at her for a moment, measured and unhurried. Then she asked if Camille had somewhere to be tonight. The answer was obviously no. Anyone could see it was no. And Adrienne, to her credit, did not make Camille say it. She simply told her that there was a guest suite in her building and that she was welcome to use it for as long as she needed, and that they could figure out the details in the morning. There were no conditions attached, no expectations stated, just an offer, direct and uncomplicated, from a woman who had learned that the most powerful thing you could extend to another person was a door held open without strings. Camille accepted. She did not know yet how much that single decision would come to define the next 8 years of her life. The guest suite became a temporary arrangement that quietly became a permanent one. Adrienne did not pressure her. She did not pepper her with questions about what had happened or where she had come from. She was nodding curious. Camille would come to understand that Adrienne noticed everything, but she had a particular discipline about not asking for things that hadn't been offered. She let Camille come to her on her own terms, and Camille, who had spent years in rooms where she had to explain herself constantly, found that kind of respect almost disorienting. 3 weeks after the accident, Camille told Adrienne about the baby. She had not told anyone, not Rochelle, not her mother, not the doctors she had been seeing under a name she had borrowed from a college acquaintance. She sat across from Adrienne at the kitchen table one morning, both of them with coffee, and she simply said it. She said she was pregnant. She said she had left her marriage. She said she was not going back. She said she did not want anything from the child's father or his family. She said she knew she was asking for a lot by staying here, and she would understand if that changed things. Adrienne listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "Finish your coffee. We have things to figure out, and that goes better with caffeine." That was who Adrienne Osei Coleman was. Not soft exactly, not sentimental, but rock solid in ways that mattered. She had built her firm, Coleman Osei Capital, from a 2-person operation in a WeWork conference room into one of the most respected mid-market investment firms in the country, and she had done it by identifying what mattered and eliminating what didn't, and by being wrong less often than anyone else in the room. When she decided Camille mattered, she applied the same precision to that. She started by asking Camille what she knew, what she was trained in, what she had done before the marriage had quietly swallowed her career ambitions. Camille had a background in finance. She had worked for 4 years at a regional investment bank before meeting Dominic, before the move to his family's city, before the long, slow fade of her professional self into the role of Hargrove Sinclair wife. She knew numbers. She knew markets. She knew how to read a balance sheet and what the footnotes actually meant and how to spot the difference between a company that was healthy and a company that had learned to look healthy. Adrienne put her to work, not in any formal, titled way at first. Just sit in on this call. Review this filing. Tell me what you see in this deck. It was a test, and Camille knew it was a test, and she performed not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because the work made her feel like herself again in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She had just spent years in a life that didn't need her to be. Her daughter was born on a clear morning in late April, 7 months after the night of the rain. Camille named her Wren, not after anyone, just for the bird, small, plainly colored, with a song that filled a room far beyond what its size seemed to allow. She held her for the first hour and said very little, and Adrian sat in the corner of the hospital room and didn't say anything at all, which was precisely the right instinct. There are moments that don't need witnesses who speak. The years that followed were not easy, and Camille never pretended they were. Being a single mother while rebuilding a career is a specific kind of tired that lives in the bones. There were nights she fell asleep at her laptop. There were mornings she sat in the car outside daycare for 5 extra minutes, because she needed those 5 minutes to be a person with no responsibilities before she walked inside and became everything to someone small. There were moments of real loneliness, not for Dominic, never for Dominic, but for a version of her life where she didn't have to be so relentlessly competent at so many things simultaneously. But there was also Adrian, who was a better mentor than Camille could have engineered if she had tried. She taught her not just how to analyze companies, but how to read rooms, how to sit in a negotiation and know exactly which silence was productive and which one meant the other side was scrambling, how to enter a space with authority without aggression, how to be the quietest person in a meeting and still be the one everyone deferred to when the decision needed to be made. These were things Camille absorbed like they were returning to her from somewhere she had always known them, which was, in fact, the truth. By year 3, she was leading due diligence on acquisitions. By year 5, she had sourced 2 deals that closed above projections and delivered returns that put Colmanose Capital on a short list it had spent years trying to get onto. By year 7, Adrian made her a partner, not as a courtesy, as a business decision. Camille Donovan had become, by any measurable standard, one of the sharpest investors in a city full of sharp investors, and the only people who didn't know it were the ones who had never expected to need to. The $5 million from the check sat in a dedicated account for the first 2 years. She didn't touch it. She needed to let it become ordinary, needed to stop seeing it as a price tag on her dignity and start seeing it as what it actually was, capital. And when she finally deployed it, she did so with a precision that would have impressed even Margaret Hargrove Sinclair, had she known. She invested quietly, deliberately, in companies adjacent to the Hargrove Sinclair Group's core holdings. She learned their supply chain from the outside. She learned their vulnerabilities, not because she had a plan yet, but because information was the only asset that couldn't be taken back once you had it. The opportunity arrived the way real opportunities usually do, not as a headline, but as a footnote. The Hargrove Sinclair Group's longtime majority shareholder, a private trust managed by a man named Franklin Oakes, announced a quiet divestiture. Franklin was 81 and tired and had never truly believed in the company's third-generation leadership. The block of shares he was selling was substantial enough to shift control of the board. The window was 60 days. Camille saw the filing on a Thursday evening. She closed her laptop, put Ren to bed, came back to her desk, and sat for a very long time in the quiet. She had not thought about the Hargrove Sinclairs in the way she once had, with hurt, or with anger, or with the specific exhaustion of trying to understand people who had never tried to understand her. She thought about them now with something cleaner, with clarity, with the detached, precise focus of an investor who has just identified an undervalued asset being mismanaged by people who should know better. She called Adrian at 10 o'clock at night, which was something she almost never did. She laid out the thesis in 7 minutes. The undervaluation, the leadership weakness, the structural problems that had been papered over for years by family reputation rather than actual performance, the board's complacency, the opportunity, if they moved quickly and quietly and did not telegraph what they were doing until they had enough shares to be unmovable. Adrian listened without interrupting. When Camille finished, there was a pause. Then Adrian asked one question. Are you doing this because it's a good deal, or because it's them? Camille had been ready for that question. She had been ready for it for years, in fact, because she had asked it of herself many times in the preceding months as the shape of this possibility had begun to clarify. She said, It's a good deal. I wouldn't bring you a bad deal dressed up in a personal story. You know that. But I won't pretend the personal part doesn't exist. I just won't let it make the decisions. Adrian said, then let's build the structure. They moved carefully. The acquisition was executed through a layered holding structure that kept Camille's name off the documentation until the position was too large to respond to. It took 11 weeks. It required 3 separate financing rounds, 2 international partners, and more late nights than Camille could accurately recall afterward. Ren spent several of those weekends with Adrienne's family, and Camille worked with the particular focus of someone who understands that some windows don't reopen. By the time the final filing went through, Coleman Osei Capital, with Camille Donovan listed as managing partner and lead investor, held 53% of the outstanding voting shares in the Hargrove Sinclair Group. The family retained 21%. The remaining shares were distributed across institutional holders who had no particular loyalty to any of them. Majority control. Effective immediately. The first call Camille made after the filing was to her mother in Ohio. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Baby, I never doubted it." Which wasn't entirely true. There had been a period of approximately 6 months in year 2 when her mother had been deeply worried, and both of them knew it. But it was the right thing to say, and Camille let her say it, and sat on her kitchen floor for a few minutes afterward and let herself feel what she had been too disciplined to feel during the 11 weeks of work. Then she got up. She had a gala to attend. The Hargrove Sinclair Group's annual shareholders gala was held on a Friday evening in November. 8 years, almost to the day, from the night Camille had walked out of that marble-floored house in the rain. The venue was a grand hall in the financial district that the family had used for 20 years, a space designed to communicate permanence and legacy and the comfortable assumption that nothing about the power structure in this room would ever change. Camille arrived 7 minutes after the official start time. Not late, just late enough to let the room fill before she entered. She wore midnight blue. Simple cut, precise tailoring, nothing performative. Ren's drawing of a bird was folded in her clutch, where it had been for every significant meeting of the past 3 years. Some rituals don't require explanation. She did not make an entrance. She simply appeared, the way that people with real authority often do, not requiring announcement, not requiring a stage, because the room responds before they've taken 4 steps and the response is its own announcement. She saw it happen in real time. The subtle shift in conversations, the heads that turned, the particular quality of attention that follows a person when people aren't quite sure what they're looking at yet, but know that they should be paying attention. Dominic was across the room when he saw her. She did not see him first. She was speaking with one of the institutional shareholders, a conversation she had been looking forward to, but she felt the moment he recognized her the way you feel a change in air pressure. When she turned, she saw his face running through its sequence. Confusion, then recognition, then something that required several emotions happening simultaneously and none of them comfortable. He looked, if she was being precise about it, the way people look when they understand they have made a catastrophic miscalculation and cannot, in this moment, quantify the full extent of it. He looked diminished, not by anything she had done to him yet, by the simple reality of who she had become while he wasn't watching. His wife, a woman named Clarissa, whom he had married 4 years ago, noticed his reaction before he had recovered from it. She followed his gaze, and she saw Camille, and there was something in the way she looked that suggested she had heard enough about Camille over the years to understand, on some level, that this was not a coincidence, and that the evening had just changed shape. Margaret Hargrove Sinclair was near the bar when she saw her. She was 71 now, and still formidable, and her face had not lost its capacity for composure. But composure and control are different things, and what Camille saw move across Margaret's features in the 2 seconds before she recovered was not composure. It was recognition. The specific recognition of a chess player who has spent the entire game believing they were winning and has just noticed, too late, that the board has been rearranged. The formal program began at 9. The chairman of the board, a man named Gerald Ashworth who had held the position for 11 years and whose allegiance had always been, first and finally, to whoever held the most shares, introduced the evening's announcement with a brevity that Camille appreciated. He noted that the company had recently completed a significant ownership transition. He noted that the new majority stakeholder would be assuming the role of chairwoman and interim CEO, effective the 1st of the month. He said her name clearly, without editorial, and invited her to say a few words. Camille stood. She did not look at Dominic when she walked to the front of the room. She did not look at Margaret. She looked at the room itself, at the institutional holders, at the senior staff, at the people who had not known her 8 years ago and had no reason to have feelings about her presence here. She thanked them briefly. She said she looked forward to the work. She said the company had strong bones and had been underusing them, and that she intended to address that. She said she would be in individual meetings with each department head beginning Monday morning. She spoke for 4 minutes. She sat down. The room was very quiet for a moment, and then it wasn't. It was not until the event was winding down, the crowd thinning, that Wren appeared. She had been with Adrian in an anteroom for the first part of the evening. Camille had wanted her there, had wanted her to see this room and know that she would always be welcome in it, but had not wanted to use her as a prop in a scene that needed to stand on its own. When Adrian brought her in, Wren was 7 years old and still in the dress she had refused to take off since Camille bought it 2 weeks ago, and she ran across the emptying hall without any awareness of the atmosphere, the history, the weight of the occasion, because she was 7 and her mother was across the room, and that was simply where she needed to be. She said "Mommy" when she was still running, and Camille turned and opened her arms and caught her, and held her, and the two of them stood there in the middle of that grand hall that had hosted 100 years of Hargrove Sinclair history, while everything quietly clicked into place around them. Dominic was still in the room. He saw it. He stood near the edge, his drink held in a hand that had not moved in a while, and he watched his daughter, his and Camille's, the child who had never known his name, who had been told simply that her father was not part of their family story, not yet, maybe not ever, run across the floor toward the woman he had once let his mother pay to disappear. His face in that moment was not something Camille saw. She was looking at Wren, but people who were in the room described it later, to each other, in the quiet way that witnesses to significant moments sometimes do. They said he looked like a man understanding, finally and completely, the true cost of every choice he had made by not making a choice at all. The board meeting was on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the gala. Camille had spent those 3 weeks in the building every day, meeting with departments, reviewing contracts, reading internal audits that had apparently not been read with any serious attention in several years. She was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they understand that the details are where the truth lives. And the truth, she found, was not flattering. Dominic had been COO for 6 years. The role had been created for him when it became clear that he would not be able to assume the CEO position with any credibility. The board had managed this quietly, the way families manage embarrassments, by building him a title that sounded substantial and a scope that could be quietly limited without appearing to be. He was not, by any objective measure, good at his job. He was personable. He was well-liked. He was the kind of leader who received strong approval ratings in surveys and poor results in operations, and who had survived as long as he had because the people above him had a personal interest in his continued employment. The board meeting began at 8 in the morning. Camille presented her findings for 40 minutes without interruption, because she had structured the presentation with the particular care of someone who has learned that people interrupt when they see an opening, and the way to prevent interruption is to leave no openings. She went through the operational failures methodically, the missed targets, the deferred decisions, the strategic drift that had cost the company 2 major clients in the past 18 months. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She simply laid out what was true and let the truth do its work. Dominic was in the room. He had been required to attend as a member of the senior leadership team. He sat very still through most of the presentation, which was a marked departure from his usual manner in meetings. He was typically someone who filled rooms, who commented often and casually, who treated business discussions as social occasions. Today he said very little. When he did speak, twice, in the first half hour, each time to offer a contextualization that felt more like a deflection, the responses he received from his fellow board members were not the instinctive support he was accustomed to. They were measured, careful, the kind of responses people give when they are reassessing their positions in real time. Margaret was present as a board member emeritus, a ceremonial designation that carried no vote but that had, in practice, always carried significant influence. Today it carried nothing. She sat at the far end of the table and she listened, and she was, for perhaps the first time in Camille's experience of her, Silent. Not composedly silent, not strategically silent, but simply without anything to say that the room would receive. When Camille finished her presentation, she recommended a leadership restructuring, specific in its scope. She named the positions that would change. She named the people who would fill them. She presented the rationale for each decision in terms that were business logical and airtight. She did not single Dominic out as a personal matter. She did not need to. The data had already done that with more precision than any personal grievance could have managed. The vote was not close. 7-2, with the 2 being predictable and the 7 representing something that felt, if not like justice, then at least like accountability finally arriving at a table it had been avoiding for years. Dominic's removal from the COO position was announced to the company in a memo that same afternoon. It was worded professionally. It thanked him for his service. It wished him well. Camille had written it herself, and she had taken considerable care to write it in a way that did not humiliate him, because humiliation had never been the point. The point was that the company needed to be run by someone who would actually run it, and that was now going to happen, and the personal history of how they had arrived at this moment was not something the rest of the organization needed to carry. What happened after the vote was something Camille had not planned for, because she had learned over the years that the most significant moments rarely arrived on schedule. As the board members were filing out, Margaret remained seated. She did not move to leave. She sat at the end of the table with her hands folded in front of her, as though she was waiting for the room to empty, and when it had, she looked at Camille across the long stretch of that table, and she said, "I would like a moment, if you'll give me one." Camille sat back down. Margaret did not apologize immediately. An apology from a woman like Margaret would have to be built up to. It was not something she was practiced at, and forcing it too quickly would have made it hollow. Instead, she said, "I told myself for years that I was protecting my family, my son, the legacy we had built." She paused for a long time. "Then, I think I was protecting my own ideas about how things were supposed to look. That's not the same thing. And it cost him more than I meant it to." Camille said, "I know." Margaret looked at her steadily. She said, "The child. Does she look like him?" It was not the question Camille had expected. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely. Then she said, "She looks like herself. She's that kind of person." Margaret nodded slowly. There was something in her face that had not been there before, not softness, exactly, but permeability. A hairline crack in something that had been sealed for a very long time. She did not ask for anything. She did not make any requests about Ren. She simply stood and straightened her jacket and walked to the door. And then she stopped, without turning around, and said, "You built something real. Whatever I thought about you, I was wrong about that." She left without waiting for a response, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing she had ever done in Camille's presence. Dominic reached out the week after the board meeting. Not by phone. A note, handwritten, left with the front desk of Coleman Osei Capital's office building. Camille's assistant brought it to her without comment, which told her something about what her assistant had probably intuited. She read it once, set it aside, thought about it for 3 days, and then called the number he had included. They met on a Saturday, at a park near the river that Camille had been bringing Ren to since she was old enough to walk. It was neutral ground in the sense that Dominic had never been there, and Camille had claimed it as her own. She brought Ren because she was not prepared to make this meeting something that happened separately from her real life, something she kept in a different compartment and managed carefully around her child. Ren deserved honesty, or at least the age-appropriate version of it, and keeping her father's existence a separate secret had always felt like the kind of thing that would cost more later than it saved now. She had told Ren, in careful and simple terms, over the past few years, that she had a father, that he was a person Camille had loved, and that things had not worked out between them, that he had not been part of their life, but that didn't mean he was a bad person, just that families came in different shapes, and theirs was the shape they had. Ren had asked questions with the particular directness that 7-year-olds possess, and that most adults spend the rest of their lives learning to suppress, and Camille had answered them as honestly as she could. She had been careful not to make Dominic a villain, because Ren was not a vehicle for her grievances and never would be. He was already at the park when they arrived. He was standing near the entrance, and he looked like a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and then forgotten all of it upon actual arrival. He looked, if Camille was being fair, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and did not know how to set it down. He saw Ren before Ren noticed him, and his face did something that Camille had not seen Dominic's face do in all the years she had known him. It cracked open, just for a moment. Something raw and unguarded and completely without strategy, which was the most honest she had ever seen him. It was, she thought, possibly the first moment of his adult life that he had experienced entirely without the cushion of his family's influence between him and the reality of his own choices. Ren looked at him with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to perform indifference. She did not run to him. She did not shy away. She simply looked, assessing, in the way she did with most things, and then she looked at her mother, and Camille gave her the small nod that meant, "It's okay, you decide." Ren looked back at Dominic and said, "You have the same color eyes as me." He said, "I do." "Yes." And his voice was not quite even. Ren appeared to process this, and then she turned and ran toward the playground because there was a particular swing she preferred and another child was approaching it. And some priorities are very clear when you are 7 years old. Camille watched her go. Dominic watched her go. And then they were left standing at the entrance of the park with everything between them and none of the usual armor. He said, "I didn't know." For a long time, he had been constructing versions of that sentence that were more elaborate, more explanatory, more self-exculpating. All of them had dissolved in the preceding 10 minutes. All that was left was the simple, inadequate, and entirely accurate truth. He had not known. He had chosen not to be in the room the night his mother made her offer, and he had told himself that he was giving Camille the dignity of a private conversation, and he had known even then that what he was actually doing was removing himself so that he would not have to make a choice. He had not known about the pregnancy. He had not tried to find out what happened to her afterward. He had moved forward into the life his family had cleared space for him, and he had tried not to think about the space she had been removed from. Camille said, "I know you didn't." And then, after a pause, "That was always the problem, Dominic. Not that you knew and didn't act, but that you never tried to know. There's a difference, and it matters." He did not argue. He had run out of the particular energy required for argument somewhere in the past 3 weeks. He asked, after a long quiet, if there was a way forward. He was careful about how he asked it. He did not ask for herself, understanding that door was closed and that it would have been insulting to pretend otherwise. He asked specifically about Ren, about whether there was a version of the future in which he could be something to her, whether he had forfeited that entirely, or whether it was something that could still be built, slowly, carefully, on terms that Camille set, and that he would be required to earn rather than simply receive. Camille took her time with the answer. She looked across the park at her daughter, at Ren on the swing, pumping her legs with the furious concentration she applied to most physical challenges, her braids flying, completely in her own world. She thought about what she had told herself in the early years, that she would never use her daughter as punishment, and never use her as currency, and never make her carry the weight of a history she hadn't created. She said, "Ren's life is not going to be built on broken promises. If you want to be part of it, you will need to be consistent in a way you have never had to be before, because she will be watching, and she is very good at knowing when something is real and when it isn't. She gets that from me." She said it without pride or edge, just as a fact. You don't get to come in and out. You don't get to show up when it's convenient. Children need to be able to predict the people who say they love them. That's what love looks like to them. So if you're asking whether the door is open, it can be. But you don't get a key. You have to knock, every time, and whether it gets answered will depend entirely on you. It was not forgiveness. Camille had made her peace with what happened, but peace and forgiveness were not the same thing, and she did not owe him the latter simply because she had arrived at the former. What she was offering was something more practical and more demanding than forgiveness. An opportunity, conditional and unguaranteed, that he would have to show up for consistently over time, and that could be revoked the moment it became clear he was not capable of that kind of consistency. Dominic nodded. He understood. For the first time in his life, he understood something fully rather than understanding the surface of it and trusting the rest to work itself out. The months that followed were quieter than the years before them, which was exactly how Camille preferred it. She ran the Hargrove Sinclair group with the same deliberate precision she had applied to acquiring it. The structural problems she had identified were addressed methodically. The results, by the end of the first year, were the clearest argument possible that the company had not been failing because of circumstances, but because of leadership, and that leadership had changed. Dominic made an appointment to see Ren 2 weeks after the park. He showed up. He was nervous in a way that Camille found, privately, to be the most hope-inspiring thing about him. Not the polished ease she had first been attracted to, but actual uncertainty, the kind that exists when something matters enough to be frightening. Ren received him with the same frank assessment she applied to everything. She showed him her drawings. She explained her opinions on several topics. She told him a very long story about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate that had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. He listened, completely, with the focused attention of someone who understands they are being given something precious and is not going to fumble it. He came back the week after, and the week after that. Camille did not watch those visits as a judge or a gatekeeper. She watched them as a mother who had made a decision about her daughter's access to her own history and who trusted that decision to reveal its wisdom over time. It was not easy exactly. Probably it would never be fully easy. But she had built her entire second life out of things that were not easy, and she had learned that difficulty and rightness often occupied the same space. There is a photograph on Camille's desk at the Hargrove Sinclair group. People notice it and occasionally ask about it. It shows a woman in a rain-soaked coat sitting in a hospital waiting room, her suitcase beside her, her hand rested over her stomach. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking at something outside the frame with an expression that is not quite hope and not quite determination, but something that lives in the territory between them. Adrian took it that night. She said later that she couldn't explain exactly why she'd taken it, that it wasn't planned, that she had simply looked at Camille sitting there and thought, "This is a person at the beginning of something, and I don't want it to be forgotten." She framed it and gave it to Camille on the day she made her a partner, and Camille had kept it on every desk she had sat at since. When people ask about it, she tells them the truth. She says it was taken the night she left a life that didn't have room for her, and that she keeps it there because it's useful to see where you started. Because there are days, in any life built from scratch, in any recovery from any kind of erasure, when the present becomes hard enough that the past looks different than it was. When you remember the comfort of the familiar and forget what the comfort was costing you. On those days, it helps to look at a photograph of yourself in a hospital waiting room with everything you owned in a suitcase and a $5 million check folded in your coat pocket, and to remember that you built everything you have standing right now from exactly that. Ren is growing up in a house where she is the most important person. She knows this not because she has been told it repeatedly, though she has, but because she can feel it in the texture of ordinary days, in the way her mother sits with her when she has something difficult to say, in the way problems are treated as solvable things rather than catastrophes, in the way the people around her model, consistently and without fanfare, what it looks like to be a person of integrity in a world that does not always reward that. She is, by every account, remarkable. She is also entirely ordinary, in the best sense. A child who likes swings and has strong opinions and makes a great deal of noise when she is happy, which is most of the time. She has her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness and her mother's capacity for paying careful attention. She draws birds. She has strong feelings about fairness. She will be, Camille thinks, on the days when she allows herself the indulgence of imagining the future, exactly who she is going to be, which is to say, fully herself, without apology, in every room she enters. That is the legacy Camille Donovan built. Not the company, not the portfolio, not the board seat or the title or the quiet, permanent reversal of a verdict that was handed down in a marble-floored house on a rainy Tuesday in November. Those things are real, and she is proud of them in a practical, clear-eyed way. But the legacy she thinks about when she is honest with herself is the one she is building every ordinary day. In an apartment where a 7-year-old leaves her drawings on the kitchen table and comes running when called and trusts, completely, and without evidence to the contrary, that she is loved. Margaret Hargrove Sinclair sent a card when Ren turned 7. Brief. No flourishes. It said, "I hope she knows how wanted she is." Camille read it twice, placed it in the drawer where she kept things she hadn't decided what to do with yet, and went to make breakfast. Some changes are slow. Some recognitions arrive very late. She had learned, over 8 years of building something out of nothing, that late was not the same as never, and that she had no use for the kind of bitterness that required her to refuse what was real just because it had taken too long to arrive. She had made her choice on a rainy November night with a check in her pocket and a door closing behind her. Every day since had been a consequence of that choice. The hard days and the proud ones, the lonely ones and the full ones, the days in the park and the days in the boardroom, and all the ordinary days in between that never make it into any story but are, in fact, where life actually lives. The woman they had paid to disappear did not disappear. She simply went somewhere they couldn't see her. And she built something there in the quiet, in the difficulty, in the accumulation of days that no one was watching, until the thing she had built was too large and too real to be ignored. Until she walked back through the front door. Until she sat at the head of the table. Until her daughter ran to her across a grand hall and said, "Mommy," and the word landed in that room and changed the air of it permanently. Some people spend their lives trying to belong in rooms that don't want them. Camille Donovan spent 8 years building the room herself. And then she opened the door, and she walked in, and she sat down, and she got to work. If this story reached something in you, something you've been carrying, something you've been fighting through, something that reminded you of your own quiet resilience, drop a comment below and tell me. And be honest with me. Do you think Dominic deserved that second chance with his daughter? Or did he give that up the night he didn't come downstairs? Comment yes or no and tell me why. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next story we're telling is one I think will stay with you even